This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast. We are now a member of the Parthenon podcast network, along with Scott Rank of History Unplugged, James Early of Key Battles of American History, and Richard Lim of This American Presidents podcast. Speaking of James Early, a big thanks goes out to Professor James Early of the Key Battles of American History podcast. Links to learn more about James and his podcast can be found at keybattlesofamericanhistory.com. To learn more about the Parthenon Podcast Network, you can go over to parthenonpodcast.com or find all of that and more in the show notes. Now, a great way to support Beyond the Big Screen is to leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. These reviews really help me know more about what you think about the show and help other people learn more about Beyond the Big Screen. You can learn more about Beyond the Big Screen, great movies and stories so great they should be movies on Facebook and Twitter by searching for A2Z History. You can also contact me there or just send me a good old-fashioned email to my email address, steve@a2zhistorypage.com. Links to all of this and more can be found at beyondthebigscreen.com. I thank you again for joining me Beyond the Big Screen. Today we are joined by James Early to talk about the movie from 2012, Lincoln. So we're really happy to have James today. James is an adjunct professor of history at San Jacinto College in Pasadena, Texas, near Houston. He has published one book and 2 scholarly articles. He also runs a blog and a Facebook group, both called American History Fanatics. His main areas of research and interest include Eastern European history, the American Civil War, and the Cold War. So he's the perfect person to have on today to talk about this movie, Lincoln. Thank you so much for joining us, James.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Steve. Great to be here.
Thank you for coming on. Very quickly, the production details. The director was Steven Spielberg. The writer is Tony Kushner, and the movie was sort of loosely based off of a book by Doris Kearns Goodwin. It gets really high Metacritic and Rotten Tomato scores at high 80s, low 90s. It had a runtime of 150 minutes, and it won 2 Academy Awards, Daniel Day-Lewis for Best Actor, and another one for costume design, I believe. We'll talk quickly about the cast, but the cast is going to keep coming up along the way. So we'll talk about some of the major players, and then we'll start digging in deeper into the episode. Basically, every actor that you've ever heard of who's crossed the stage or the silver screen in the past 40 years is in this movie. Tell us a little bit about the people who were involved in this event of the last several months of the Civil War, but the movie particularly delves into the machinations, if you will, around the passage of the 13th Amendment.
Sure, Steve. Well, first of all, obviously the central character is Abraham Lincoln himself. He's in about 95% of the movie. He is masterfully portrayed by Daniel Day-Lewis, who prior to this film had already won 2 Oscars for Best Actor, and he got his 3rd one for this role. So he's the only person in history to win 3 Oscars, at least for an actor. And then, of course, there's a lot of subcurrents that run throughout the movie. You have Lincoln's relationship with his family members, especially his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, who's played by Sally Field. Also an Oscar winner, not for this film. She was nominated for Best Supporting Actress, but had won Best Actress a long time ago in another movie. So their relationship is portrayed. It was often strained, to say the least. You also have Robert Todd Lincoln, which is Lincoln's oldest son. He's played by Joseph Gordon-Levitt. They had a difficult relationship at times as well. And then you have the youngest son, Tad Lincoln, who was just was Abraham Lincoln's the apple of his eye. He could just do no wrong, and he was kind of a spoiled child. In addition to the family relationships, you have Lincoln's relationship with his cabinet, especially his Secretary of State, William Seward, who was played by David Strathairn, who's been in a lot of different movies. He was nominated for Best Actor for Good Night and Good Luck. That's about 10 years ago or so. You have figures from the Union Army. General Grant is portrayed. He has a little bit of screen time. You have the House of Representatives, of course. The main person from there is Thaddeus Stevens, the leader of the radical Republicans in the House of Representatives. He's portrayed by Tommy Lee Jones. Of course, everybody knows who Tommy Lee Jones is. He's won awards in the past, and I think he actually won Best Supporting Actor for The Fugitive way back a long time ago, 20 years ago maybe or so. He was nominated for Best Supporting Actor for his role here as Thaddeus Stevens, and that's a really good portrayal. You have different congressmen, and we'll talk about this later, but it's interesting that you actually have some real congressmen who are portrayed in the movie, and then others who are kind of made up or made to signify somebody who was real, although they didn't use the real name. You also have some Republican operatives who are not elected officials, especially Francis Preston Blair, who, I mean, goodness, he goes all the way back to the days of Andrew Jackson. He's portrayed by Hal Holbrook, also somebody who's won a lot of awards in the past. You have some operatives that work for Seward, basically, and the main one is a fellow named William Bilbo. He's portrayed by James Spader. He's another award-winning actor. I'm going to sound like a broken record when I keep saying award-winning, but I mean, they just really had a fantastic cast. And then you have some people who are from the Confederacy, in particular, Alexander Stephens, who's the Confederate vice president. He's portrayed by Jackie Earle Haley. So very complex story. It's not just about the 13th Amendment. You have, again, as I mentioned, you have family relationships, you have cabinet relationships, you have political relationships, you have the war going on, you have possible peace negotiations between Lincoln and Confederate officials. And so it makes for a very, I guess to use a modern slang term, there's a lot of moving parts.
Yes, definitely. You could say that I've been trying to count them up along the way. There's probably 4 different themes going on. The 13th Amendment, the peace rapprochement with the Confederate delegation, the inside the family relations of the Lincolns, and then fourthly, the situation of the war. So this, in 150 minutes, they jam a lot of action into one movie.
They really do. It could have easily been, I think you and I discussed this offline a while back, it could have been a 6-hour miniseries. Easily. Oh, yeah. Like, or more, like the John Adams one, for example.
The historical context of the movie is the passage of the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which is a pretty simple affair. All it says is there's 2 sections. Section 1 says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. And then Section 2 is just saying that the Congress has the power to make laws appropriate to this, which I think just about every amendment to the Constitution has something to that effect, a section to that effect. So it's a fairly simple text that, I mean, it cost hundreds of thousands of lives and years of war and one of the most contentious political debates in U.S. history to get that one sentence onto the books of the Constitution. This movie is the story of how that amendment was adopted in the shadow of those waning days of the U.S. Civil War. Now, before we get into the meat of the issue, what is the very, very short flow chart of how a constitutional amendment gets added?
Well, sure. What happens is it has to be proposed as a bill, just like any other bill. It has to be proposed in the House and the Senate separately. And it has to be voted upon, and in order for it to pass either or both houses, it has to be voted. It has to be voted yes by 2/3 of the people. So, in other words, 2/3 of the senators have to vote yes, 2/3 of the congressmen have to vote yes. And by the way, let me point out in passing that it's 2/3 of the people there present voting. So not necessarily 2/3 of the total membership of the House or Senate. Okay, so yeah, and they're, how do I say it? They highlight this in the fact that some of the representatives just couldn't bring themselves to vote for it, but they were okay with just kind of disappearing and not being present, so that they didn't count. I guess you could say they don't count the denominator or the numerator. So they weren't. It wasn't the same as a no vote. A no vote counts as a 0 in the numerator and a 1 in the denominator, if I can use mathematical language. But I have a background in math, so anyway. But by abstenting, they take themselves completely out of the picture. So anyway, once the two houses pass it, it goes to the states, and you have to have 3/4 of the states ratify it, which means the state legislature basically says, yes, we agree with this, or no, we don't agree with it. And you have to have 3/4. Interestingly enough, the president does not have to sign it. It doesn't. President has nothing to do with it other than trying to get people to vote for it, if he wants them to, as we see in this movie. One of the issues that they dealt with at the time was, what do you do? How do you count the Confederate states? So if this amendment goes out to the state legislatures, is it 3/4 of all the states, including the Confederate ones? Or is it 3/4 of the states that did not secede? And, you had, 11 states secede? So that's a pretty significant number of the total number of states. I can't remember exactly how many states there were at the time. But 11 is a significant amount of them. And we see this in one scene, I guess, kind of toward the end, when Alexander Stephens and his two colleagues are speaking with Lincoln and Seward, and he says, basically, can we be readmitted to the Union so that we can block this amendment? Because obviously, none of the Confederate states wanted to vote for this. They didn't want to vote to free all the slaves, because that would basically destroy their economic livelihood, especially the leaders themselves, all of whom were wealthy, or at least most of whom, the overwhelming majority of whom were wealthy slaveholders themselves.
So that is an interesting part of the movie that they didn't really grasp or grapple with. Was there an issue of it passing the state portion of that flow chart?
Well, no, they didn't talk about that really at all in the movie. But, you had some states that were very, I guess, let's use the term progressive and very anti-slavery. That would be mainly New England. Some of the Midwestern states, too, what we would call Midwestern, like Wisconsin and others, were pretty radical. And there was no doubt that they were going to ratify it. But you had other states that were more conservative, especially the border states. You had 4 states that were slave states, but they did not secede. And those would be Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. They ended up not seceding, but they had a significant number of slaves, except for Delaware, which didn't have very many. But anyway, so those states, were they going to voluntarily give up slavery? And then you had other states like, let's say, New York, Ohio, parts of Illinois, parts of Indiana. They were, especially the southern parts of those states, were very highly connected to the southern states, culturally as well as economically. And so it was kind of a question mark. Would this pass all the states? And would you get it was going to be hard enough even to get 3/4 of the Union states that did not secede, let alone 3/4 of the total number of the states.
Let's follow through with Lincoln a little bit, especially his character and his personality, and then his relationships with his family, which was an important portion of this movie. I guess you'd have to say first off that Daniel Day-Lewis was out of this world as Lincoln. I don't think, maybe once or twice did he come across that you were like, oh wait, this isn't Abraham Lincoln acting in this movie.
Oh yeah, absolutely. He just nailed it. Quite possibly. I've seen a lot of his movies, and of course I'm maybe biased because I'm a history buff, and I love the Civil War, but and I like Lincoln a lot. But I think this is his best performance ever. And he really carries across how Lincoln's weariness and his tiredness. You can see the lines in his face. And part of this is the makeup, of course, but just the worry and the haggardness of his face and his body, and just how he was, every president, we always talk about how the presidency ages people, and you look at somebody's picture when they first become president, and then you look at it 4 years later, 8 years later, and they look 10 years older. But Lincoln, I mean, you look at his picture before and after, and he looks 20 years older.
Mm-hmm. In the very first scene of the movie, Lincoln is chatting up some soldiers, and he tells a homespun story, and that's something that he'll do just about every major scene that he's in. He starts it off with a homespun story. This first one, though, it's interesting because it really sets the stage for the movie. Can you tell us a little bit about that scene? And there were a couple of inaccuracies that I think were interesting to point out.
Yeah, well, the movie gets right the fact that Lincoln loved to tell stories. And I've read quite a bit about Lincoln, and one thing that is not always known by the average person is that Lincoln struggled with depression. Back in that day, they called it melancholy, but we would call it depression today. Probably he would have been diagnosed, if he were alive today, with clinical depression, and he might have had meds prescribed. But he grew up in a house where his beloved mother died when he was very young. His father was really hard on him, tough, treated him kind of like a slave a lot of the time. And Lincoln was deprived formal education. He went to school for maybe about a year and a half or something total in his whole life. So he was completely self-educated. And he just really struggled with this depression. Sometimes his friends feared for his life. They thought he might commit suicide or something. But I think his humor was one way he dealt with it. We see that in a lot of cases where people who struggle with depression overcome it through the use of humor. And so, yeah, he liked to tell these stories, and his stories usually had a point, almost always had something to do with the current situation that was going on. So the problem I have with the opening scene is that, well, there's two problems. Number one, Lincoln was approachable. He was not imperious necessarily in the sense that he would talk to just about anybody. But I don't know that right after a battle he would have been sitting there chatting with just common soldiers. That seems hard to swallow, and I've read that that's probably not entirely accurate. The second thing is the soldiers start quoting from the Gettysburg Address, and that would not have happened, because as much as the Gettysburg Address is venerated today as one of the greatest speeches ever, certainly in American history, it wasn't all that popular at the time. In fact, a lot of people said, "Oh, this is terrible. This is a terrible speech." He goes up there and he talks for 2 minutes, which back in those days, politicians would speak for hours and hours. And so I don't think people would have committed that to memory and quoted it back at him. And I know one of the African American soldiers is very kind of brash and kind of pushy, and that people just wouldn't have done that back in those days. People knew their place in society, and they didn't tend to be as egalitarian as we are today.
A couple of scenes later, but in the same line of Lincoln's family life, he goes up to Tad's, and Tad's, I think he must be about 8 at that time.
Yeah, that's about right.
And he's sleeping on the floor, and there's a scene Lincoln lays down with him, and then he moves Tad into probably his bedroom, and he whispers to Tad whispers to Abraham Lincoln, "Oh, are you bringing Willie to bed?" And I just wonder, what did that play with Lincoln's psychology, that he's fighting this terrible, terrible war, and then to have a son die while he's in office?
Well, obviously that would have been devastating, and it was. And in fact, it was even more devastating for Mary Todd. Mary Todd, we would say today, just kind of cracked up for a while. And it's not like she was unable to function, but she consulted mediums, and they had seances, and she was trying to talk to Willie. Willie passed away in 1862, so that would have been just under 3 years before the movie starts. And by the way, Tad was, I just looked it up, he was 11, almost 12, so a little older. I think the boy in the movie was probably a little younger than that. But anyway, what I was getting at is that you read about this time period, and I know you know this, Steve, but all of these people had great tragedy in their lives. All of them lost children because disease was just rampant. They did not have anything approaching modern medicine, and children especially were prone to dying when they're 2, 3, 4, 5. I mean, you couldn't throw a rock and not hit somebody. Several people probably who had lost a child. You know, like Stonewall Jackson lost a child when he was lost a young child. Almost every one of these figures lost at least one child. And I'm not saying it. I'm not trying to minimize the sense of loss that Lincoln would have felt, but at the same time, it was almost expected. You know, if you're going to have 4 kids, you'll be lucky if 2 of them make it to adulthood.
Interestingly enough, though, his son Robert, who is quite a bit older, he's in his 20s and he's studying law at Harvard, and he comes back,
Right.
and Lincoln is really cold with him. Is that a accurate portrayal that we know of, that Lincoln was harder on Robert than he was with Tad, who he was completely indulgent to?
Yeah, it is. It's very accurate. I wouldn't necessarily say he was harder with Robert, but it's just that they had a very cold relationship. I've read that Lincoln's relationship with Robert was similar to Lincoln's relationship with his own father, which was just very cold and distant and businesslike. Part of that is because when Robert was born and was growing up, Lincoln was always gone. He was on the circuit. When he was a lawyer in Illinois, he didn't spend a whole lot of time in Springfield, which is where they lived. He would ride the circuit, which meant he would go on a horse or a carriage to different towns and hear cases all over the place. You've heard of a circuit riding preacher, where a preacher goes from town to town and preaches. Well, he was a circuit riding lawyer. So yeah. And by the time Tad came into the picture, Lincoln, I think, was home a little bit more. And it is true that Lincoln completely spoiled Tad. I mean, he never disciplined him. Never disciplined him. Tad was very rambunctious, just as the movie portrayed. I mean, there are stories about him running around, and there's a scene in the movie where it's really funny, actually, where they're at a cabinet meeting, and the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, is beginning to discuss the Union invasion of Fort Fisher and then Wilmington, the city of Wilmington, North Carolina, which was the last Confederate port that was still open. And Stanton begins his presentation, and then he stops cold, and he says, "Why is this map burned?" They show the map, and there's like a singed corner. And he says to Lincoln, "Did the boy burn it?" And Lincoln kind of dodges the question. You know, he says something like, I can't remember exactly what he says. So he doesn't say, "Oh yeah, he did," but he also doesn't deny it. So yeah, and the movie shows Tad, like, he would wear a little military uniform, and he would charge to the White House, you know, just bowling people over, and he would run in the middle of cabinet meetings and jump in Lincoln's lap. And so yeah, it's kind of touching, actually. But yeah, I should say that his treatment of Robert was not very touching, and I'm not saying he was necessarily mean or harsh, but he just didn't show him the attention that he showed the younger children. And ironically enough, Robert was the only one to really live to adulthood. Willie died in 1862. I think he was about 10 at the time. There was another son who had died even earlier, and then Tad is going to die when he gets to be about 18. So Robert actually went on to have a distinguished career. He was in the cabinet of James Garfield, and he lived well into the 1920s. He lived long enough to see the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial. Anyway, I'm kind of off track here, but that's a fun fact for the day.
Mary Todd Lincoln, they had a pretty tumultuous marriage, where I don't think that Lincoln actually wanted to marry her in the first place. And so what kind of life did they have, especially leading into those last few months of Lincoln's life and also the Civil War?
Yeah, Mary Todd and her relationship with Lincoln was very tumultuous, we'll put it that way. I believe that they really did truly love each other. I don't think it was a passionate love. As you mentioned, Lincoln had wanted to marry someone else. He had one young lady that he was madly in love with, and she died of disease before. And he actually had gotten involved with Mary Todd. We courted her, I guess, and then broke it off, and then started again, and then they got married. Mary Todd had a mercurial temper, and she could go from being really friendly and nice and fun to being a holy terror in no time at all. And one thing that affected that toward the end of their marriage, or the last few years of Lincoln's life, and it's alluded to in the movie. They don't go into a lot of detail about it, but Mary had a carriage accident in a couple years before this had taken place, and she hit her head on a rock. She was thrown from a carriage and hit her head, and from that time on, she suffered from very bad migraine headaches, and those did not help her mood. But there were times when they were kind and they were touching, and they were very again, I'm not going to say passionate, but very cordial to each other. We see that in the movie where there's a scene toward the end where they're riding in a carriage together. And other times they would get into fights. My understanding from what I've read about their relationship is that Lincoln tended not to give as good as he got. He would tend to just leave the room, walk away, go somewhere. I know was one scene in the movie where they're yelling back and forth. I don't know that that's completely accurate. I mean, Mary's side is accurate. There's no doubt. Mary would throw things at him and say, accuse him of things that she later apologized for and regretted. I don't know that Lincoln, we'll talk about this later, but Lincoln was famous for having a very mild temper. Lincoln didn't burst into tantrums.
Let's start to follow up on, maybe we can combine two of the themes, the theme of the ending of the Civil War and then the peace delegation from the Confederacy.
Sure.
First, starting out with the end of the Civil War, this is the last 6 months-ish or so. What was happening? Was the war naturally settling down at that point? Did people have a feeling that it was ending?
Yes. It was kind of like, if to use an analogy of World War II, after D-Day, it was pretty clear that Germany was going to lose. They were retreating in France. They were being pushed back by the Russians in the east. But everybody knew the writing was on the wall, but it just was going to take some more time to wrap it up. And the same thing was true right here. The Confederacy had lost several entire states. The Mississippi had been captured. It had been opened up completely. The Confederacy was cut in two. The fall of Vicksburg about a year and a half before this had ensured that, and all the ports were closed except for Wilmington, as I mentioned earlier. So, and basically Lee's army was surrounded by, not surrounded, but it was under siege by Grant's army outside of the city of Petersburg, Virginia, which is not far from Richmond. So basically Grant had Lee's army by the throat, and he was just waiting for the winter to let up so that the roads would be better and he could start attacking. And, at the same time, they were, as I mentioned, it was a siege. It was not a complete siege because the Confederate Army was able to get some supplies from the western part of Virginia, but they were suffering from desertion, and Grant was actually getting more troops, whereas Lee's army was shrinking and they were getting spread thin, and it was just really a matter of time. Yeah.
What was the situation inside of the Confederate government to make them want to sue for peace, or at least, if not exactly sue for peace, try to do something to get peace rolling?
Well, I'm a chess player, and in chess, you can basically propose a draw to the other player. A draw is a tie, basically, so you don't lose. You walk away with a little bit of respect. And sometimes when you get a little bit down in material, people will offer a draw. In other words, you're hoping to avoid the loss, hoping your opponent will be, I guess, chivalrous or whatever and won't completely crush you, but will say, yeah, okay, a draw. So I think that's kind of the position that the Confederacy was in. They were down. They were up against the ropes. They were down on the mat, to mix my metaphors there. But so I think they were struggling and just trying, is there any way that maybe we can talk the Union into, because there was a big desire for peace in the North, in particular in the Democratic Party. You had in the Democratic Party war Democrats and peace Democrats. And at this time, the war Democrats were stronger, but there were a lot of people that wanted the war to end, no matter what, for any reason. And a lot of Northerners, especially Democrats, but not necessarily all Democrats, a lot of people in the North objected to this idea of emancipating the slaves. See, the Senate had already passed the 13th Amendment. The House had voted on it in April of 1864, and it was voted down. We'll talk about that more later. But and a lot of Northerners were saying, let's just call it. The Confederacy is beaten, and if they're willing to surrender, we'll just basically pretend this last 4 years didn't happen, and we'll go back to the way things were before the war. But Lincoln was not willing to do that. Lincoln had evolved a lot in his thinking. At the start of the war, Lincoln, even before the war, when Lincoln was running for president and when he was elected, he had told the South, I will not interfere with slavery. And I think he would not have. Lincoln was not a radical Republican. He was a moderate. He was willing to let slavery continue to exist where it already existed. What he was adamant on is that he did not want slavery to spread any further to the west or into the north, as some Confederates wanted to be allowed to do. But as the war progressed, Lincoln became a little bit more and more radical gradually. I mean, he never really quite was in the camp of Thaddeus Stevens and the other radicals, but he was getting closer. He wanted to be gentle on the South as well. But when the South sent this peace delegation, right out of the bat, they started talking about two nations. Okay, the document that they wanted to present to Lincoln, this peace commission led by Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, it said something about our two nations. And Lincoln said to him, no, there's not two nations, there's one nation. That's one thing Lincoln would not budge on. Lincoln always held that, legally at least, the states never left the Union. The states did not secede. They just were taken over by a bunch of radicals and rebels, and the individual rebels are the ones that conducted this rebellion. So it wasn't a war between two independent nations. It was just a rebellion within one nation. I don't know if that answered your question, but maybe I touched on it at least.
But we can see that from those three themes of the peace delegation, the war winding down, and Lincoln's family life, that Lincoln had a lot of pressure from many different sides that could have easily derailed the 13th Amendment, that the people in the North were war weary, and there was many people who wanted to get this amendment through, but because of almost even the timeline, if things didn't fall together just so, there's a very good chance that the amendment might not have happened. And
absolutely. Politically, what was going on politically was totally dependent on what was going on militarily. If the Union had been losing a lot of battles lately, there would have been no 13th Amendment, at least not at that time.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. With they show a lot of political wrangling and debates in Congress. How accurate was that? To me, it seemed like it was a little too, especially given, I don't know how it compares to modern day procedure, but it's very procedural in that usually congressmen get to say their piece and then somebody else responds within a given time limit. here they were giving speeches and getting yelled at and getting questions and other people taking over. Was it more freewheeling back then than it is now?
I think it was a little more freewheeling, but I think that they took liberties with the way things would have really been to make the movie more dramatic. First of all, in the House of Representatives, as in the Senate, when you give a speech, you do not directly address another member of the House or Senate. You address the chairman, which, of course, in the House is the Speaker of the House. So you say, Mr. Speaker, da-da-da-da-da, the gentleman from Pennsylvania is deluded. I mean, they would certainly say insulting things. And Thaddeus Stevens was one of the chief insulters. They got that right. You know, Thaddeus Stevens, I don't know that he literally said the words that were put in his mouth by the writer and by Spielberg, but he was brutal with his speeches. You know, he would just completely. So that was good. But this idea of turning around and saying, you are a nincompoop. Some of the language is hilarious. You fatuous nincompoop. You worthless slime. You know, that would not have happened that way. It would have been slightly more procedural. You know, he would have told the speaker, the gentleman from New York is a complete idiot, or, you know, something like that. But yeah.
Initially, it's William Seward and Abraham Lincoln. They work out this plan of how to get the 13th Amendment passed. And I got the real feeling that I don't think I ever got before this movie is how shrewd and clever of a politician Abraham Lincoln is. I think throughout the years he's been maybe sainted too much, and you miss out that this guy man had a much deeper character than what he's portrayed as now.
Right. I think that when a president is murdered, they tend to have a halo put on them. You know, I know for most of our lives, John F. Kennedy has been idealized and idolized, and Lincoln is the same thing. And people forget Lincoln, first of all, was a politician. Every person that goes into the presidency is a politician in one form or another. Lincoln was extremely intelligent, extremely shrewd, and he, like you said, he was not above resorting to, I don't know, I'm not going to say unethical, but just sneaky, tricky, what's the word? I don't know. He would do whatever it takes sometimes to get his will brought about. And in this case, it was for a good cause. It was for the 13th Amendment. But yeah, from what I've read, they pretty much got that right in that, well, first of all, William Seward, who was the Secretary of State, was really Lincoln's right-hand man. He had been his rival in 1860. Seward was the leading, kind of the front runner, the leading candidate to get the Republican nomination, but he didn't. He was seen as too radical. He had made some speeches which used some very strong language against the South and against slavery, and so people thought he would not have a chance of being elected. So the people at the convention turned to Lincoln instead. And to his credit, you know, Seward could have just said, well, okay, fine. If y'all don't want me, I'm going to just go take my ball and go home, you know. But Seward didn't. I mean, Lincoln purposely reached out to his rivals. He appointed 3 other men, and that's why the book that this movie's based upon is called Team of Rivals. Lincoln appointed 3 other men who had sought the Republican nomination in 1860 to be his cabinet members, and Seward was his chief rival, so he gave him the number 1 spot, Secretary of State. And Seward was loyal to Lincoln. He was his right-hand man. He was his advisor, so they get that right. There was a close relationship between the 2 men, and Lincoln really valued Seward's opinion. And basically the impression that I've gotten, I read some books just about the 13th Amendment, and Lincoln wanted it passed, and he wanted it passed fast. He wanted it passed before the current Congress goes out of session. If I can, let me talk a little about how congressional terms and elections worked. It's very different from now.
Yeah, definitely, because that's important.
Now, because people don't understand this now, because we're kind of a much quicker society. Everything's fast. If you run for Congress and you're elected, you run in November, you get elected in November, or you run before that, obviously. But if you get elected in November, you take your seat in January, 2 months later. So it's really quick. But back then, well, first of all, there was no standardized time for people to be voted. Different states had their elections at different times. A lot of them had it in November like we do now, but others didn't. And if you were elected, let's say in November, to the Congress, you did not take office until the following December.
Oh, wow.
Okay? I'm talking 13 months later. So if you're a lame duck, you're a major lame duck. And that was what was going on here is Lincoln wanted, the Congress was going to go out of session. The movie starts in January of 1865. The Congress was going to go out of session in, well, let me back up a step. Obviously, in 1864, when Lincoln was elected to his second term, there was a congressional election. And what happened then is almost half of the Congress was sent home packing. Okay, there was a lot of turnover back in those days. Nowadays, we talk about how, well, once you get in, the power of the incumbency is great and you seldom get voted out of office. And that's true today, but it was not necessarily true. Well, it wasn't true at all back then. I was reading that the average for the first 100 years or so of the U.S., and maybe even a little longer, the average turnover rate was like 40%. So from one Congress to the next, almost half would be booted out. And in this case, that it was about 50%. So of the people who ran, of the people who were in the current Congress, the 38th Congress, which is the one that's in office when the movie takes place, of the people in that Congress, almost half were sent home. And so you had a lot of these guys who were going to need a job. As Lincoln says, they're going to be looking for work. And Lincoln controlled obviously the federal bureaucracy, or at least a lot of it, and there were a lot of government jobs that he had control over. So what he decided to do was he could have just waited, okay? And they could have just said, well, let's let the new Congress come in December of 1865, the Congress that was voted in November of 1864. Let's let the new Congress come in, and they will definitely pass it because it was a much more radical, much more Republican Congress. But Lincoln wanted it done right away. And it's a good thing, too. He didn't know this at the time, but he would not have lived to see it, obviously, if he had waited. And so what he decides to do is to try to persuade several of the lame duck congressmen who had voted against the bill the first time, the amendment, the first time it came up in April of 1864. He wanted to persuade them to vote again, but to change their vote and to vote in favor of the amendment. And so he basically tells William Seward, make it happen. Okay. I don't care what you do. I don't want to know about it. Okay. In fact, I think today we would use the term plausible deniability. I think Seward even says something along the effect of then you'll be able to deny things. So Lincoln didn't want to get his hands dirty, but he told Seward, you go make it happen. And so Seward hires, in some accounts I've read, he hires 4 people. In the movie, he hires 3. It doesn't really matter, but he hires these guys to go and basically offer government jobs to these lame duck congressmen who are about to be out of office. And there's no indication at first that they offered cash, just straight out cash, but they might have. We just don't know. The movie has to kind of, I guess, fill in a lot of the blanks. And we see scenes where there's one scene where James Spader runs into a guy on purpose in the bank and makes it look like an accident. And while he's picking up what the guy dropped, another one of the guys that Seward had hired shows him the bill and everything. And there's scenes where James Spader almost gets shot by one guy who obviously didn't want to vote for the amendment. So all that, we don't know if that's truth or fiction. It's probably highly fictionalized. But the big picture is correct in that Seward hired some kind of shady characters to go out there and just make it happen, get these guys to change. I think they needed 20 people who had voted against it to change their votes to in favor.
Those shady characters, it was in the movie, they were Bilbo, Shell, and Latham. Now, at least yes. Bilbo was an actual historical person, and I think the other 3 were as well.
Yeah, they were all historical people. I'm not. It's not clear to me whether the third guy, Shell, was actually hired to do this. You read his Wikipedia article, and it's kind of short and doesn't really say much. It doesn't mention that he worked for Seward. There were a couple of other guys that were also hired that are not mentioned in the movie. So, but yeah, Bilbo is definitely, and he's obviously the most colorful one in the movie. Bilbo is an interesting guy. He was actually a Southerner who I think I remember he had been in favor of secession, but he later moved to the north and changed his opinion. And he was a Democrat. Politically, he was a Democrat, but he worked for the Republicans here, obviously.
What was their actual qualifications to do that sort of work? Was that something that they were doing along the way, some sort of lobbying?
They had I think, had some experience with it in the past. I'm not a big expert on these three people, but obviously they were people who had connections and knew how to sweeten the deal for people.
These congressmen that they were lobbying to change their vote with sometimes cash, sometimes the possibility of certain lucrative federal jobs, these weren't based on historical characters. The ones who were steadfast against the 13th Amendment, like Fernando Wood, was an actual congressman from New York and mayor of New York City.
Right.
But
right.
Not all of the congressmen that they were talking about that they actually did get to change their vote were, in fact, historical characters. What did Spielberg do in the movie?
Yeah, I can't really obviously get inside of his head or the writer Kushner, but you're right. It's very odd to me that, in some ways, it's odd that some of the people portrayed are actual flesh and blood congressmen. You mentioned Fernando Wood. There was also George Pendleton of Ohio. Those are the two main antagonists, if you will, the two main people who are opposed to the bill. And the people that are pro-bill, obviously, Thaddeus Stevens is obviously a real person. You had the Speaker of the House, Schuyler Colfax. They show several radical Republicans. They show Senator Sumner, who obviously he was a senator, so he didn't have a vote in this. He had voted in favor of it or in the Senate earlier. You had Ben Wade, who was the leader of the radicals in the Senate. But then one of the other main congressman who was a radical and in favor of the bill was a fellow named Henry Winter Davis. And Davis and Wade would go on later. In fact, they had already done this. Historically, it was in 1864. They had passed a bill called the Wade-Davis Bill, which was going to try to make it tough on the southern states to get back in. But Henry Winter Davis, they changed his name, and he's Asa something. I can't remember. I remember Asa Vintner Lytton. Yeah. So there's a meeting with the radicals, and you have the real Stevens, the real Ben Wade, the real Schuyler Colfax, the real James Ashley. We'll have to talk about him a little. James Ashley was the floor manager of the bill, but then not the real Henry Winter Davis. And as far as as you mentioned, the people who were going to change their minds, people who had either voted against it in 1864 or who had not been present for the vote, two of them are real. And these are Alexander Coffroth, who is from Pennsylvania, a Democrat. And, of course, they're all Democrats, the ones who voted against it. And the other one is, I'm drawing a blank. George Yeaman of Kentucky. He's the one who had a beard and no mustache. Looks kind of like Joaquin Phoenix, I think. But those are real people. But then you had, if you remember the scene, there's a scene where they're just calling off names. Okay, so-and-so, so-and-so, so-and-so from Ohio. They called off about 5 or 6 names in a row of people they were going to approach. Those were all fake. And I don't know why they faked some people and put real ones in. But I think maybe, at least in the case of the people who changed their vote, I think they probably wanted to, this is what I'm thinking anyway, I could be totally wrong, but I'm thinking they wanted to protect the memory of the congressman who changed their vote. In other words, what if I'm the great-great-grandson of Congressman Figowitz from New Jersey who changed his vote? I don't want a movie saying that my great-great-grandfather took a bribe and changed his vote, so maybe they're protecting the identities of the names have been changed to protect the guilty, something like that. That's just my theory. I could be completely wrong, but anyway, that's what I think.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors. It's interesting you mentioned James Ashley because he has somewhat of a role in the movie. He's played by David Constable. Mm-hmm. But in actuality, he had a much more powerful role in getting the bill passed or the amendment passed.
Yeah, he really did. Ashley did a lot of the lobbying as well. That they don't show that in the movie. In the movie, he's just kind of the guy who pushes things along on the House floor mainly. But yeah, he also lobbied people and talked to other congressmen and tried to get them to persuade their vote. Lincoln himself did with a few congressmen, not too many. Stevens probably did as well. I think the scene where Alexander Coffreth comes into Stevens' office is probably fictional. It's hilarious. I love it. It's great. Stevens keeps mispronouncing his name. He calls him Cough Drop. He calls him Cough Snot. But yeah, actually, absolutely had a much larger role in real life than he did in the movie. I'm not really sure why they kind of toned him down. Maybe because nobody knows who he is today. I don't know. Most people probably don't even know who Thaddeus Stevens is, to be honest with you. But he's a little bit more famous, though, at least. So maybe they put some of what Ashley did with Stevens.
Ultimately, the ending of the movie is that the 13th Amendment passes and everybody's, the town is overjoyed. And the movie has about a half an hour left after that. And we were talking offline about this, that the movie just didn't seem to know where to quite end.
Yeah, I agree. We were talking about this. It's almost as if they couldn't decide what is the movie really about. Is it a movie about the passage of the 13th Amendment? Or is it a movie about Lincoln's life? Or is it a movie about the war? And I think they tried to split the difference. And that's fine. It doesn't bother me. Some people would say, oh, it's too long. I mean, my opinion is if a movie's good, I don't mind it being long. One of my favorite movies is Gettysburg, which is almost 4 hours long, but I'm a Civil War nut, so I'm eating up every minute of it. I imagine the average person who doesn't even know who half these people are might think, oh, it should have been shorter. As you mentioned, if they had made it pretty much almost all about the 13th Amendment, they could have cut it off. I think I watched some online reviews of this, people that make YouTube videos that are movie reviews, and I was watching one and they said they should have ended it where the amendment passes and Thaddeus Stevens goes home and shows it to his basically his common law wife, who was also his housekeeper. And that could have ended it right there. Or they could have shown Lincoln walking out of, I don't know. But yeah, I think they wanted to also make the movie, bring the war to a conclusion, basically, and they wanted to bring Lincoln to a conclusion himself, Lincoln's life. I think had they left out the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, and if they had left out the assassination of Lincoln, they might have gotten criticized. I don't know. It's hard to please. Lincoln himself used to say, you can't please all the people all the time. But I think they had a pretty effective compromise. I don't mind the extra 30 minutes at the end, again, because I'm a Civil War nut, and I like to see Lee and Grant, and I don't like to see the assassination, but I like to see dramatizations of it and things like that.
I think, I have to agree with you that they had a lot of bows that they had to tie up, and it just so happened that it took probably longer than they would have even wanted. I mean, that's my guess. I don't want to speak for the producers, but you really couldn't leave the Civil War hanging, and you couldn't leave the assassination hanging without having some sort of finality to it.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
It probably is important to discuss just quickly, what was the ultimate effect of the 13th Amendment?
Well, the 13th Amendment, basically, the short answer is it abolished slavery throughout the United States of America. Lincoln, and he talks about this at the beginning of the movie, he had issued the Emancipation Proclamation in late 1862 after the Battle of Antietam, and it went into effect on January 1st, 1863. But the Emancipation Proclamation, a lot of people think, oh, that was the end of slavery, but it actually wasn't. The Emancipation Proclamation, first of all, was a wartime measure, and Lincoln, some people accuse Lincoln of breaking the law, said it was unconstitutional at the time, but Lincoln said, well, I'm the commander-in-chief of the United States Army, and I have the right to take away the property, not all property, but certainly slave property of people who have rebelled against the government. it's a wartime measure. It was justified this way. If you think about it, in the South, it was the slaves who were doing things like, harvesting the crops, making the bread, serving the meals, things like that, chopping wood, building things. And so the fact that you had this unpaid labor force in the South freed up a lot of white men to go out to the battlefield, whereas in the North, the people who were serving the meals and the people who were working in the fields were white males, primarily. There were some white females, of course, but so the argument was, a lot of Lincoln's generals told him from the very get-go, if we let's say capture a plantation and we send away the slaves, then we are basically diminishing the Confederacy's ability to make war against us. And at first, Lincoln didn't really like that idea, but over time he became more open to it. And so he issued the Emancipation Proclamation with the sole purpose, basically the motivation behind it, or at least the reasoning, the justification was that this will hurt the Confederacy's ability to wage war against us. But the Emancipation Proclamation only was effective in areas under rebellion that the Union, areas under rebellion, let's put it that way, okay? So it didn't apply to the border states. It did not free any slaves in Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, or Delaware. And if you think about it, it didn't really have any effective power in areas that the Union had not captured. For example, if you're a plantation holder down in Georgia and you hear, the president says your slaves are freed, what are you going to say? You're going to say, yeah, well, come get them. It would be like, I always tell my students this. Let's say the president of Iran issues a law saying that you have to send him your car. What would you do? And the students all say, well, I'd tell them to go jump in the lake. They don't say that phrase, but that's kind of an old phrase that I learned from my dad. But basically the point is that the Emancipation Proclamation didn't free that many slaves at first, but over time, as the Union Army advanced further and further into the South, it did take effect and free more and more slaves. And then it also gave the slaves the ability to join the Union Army eventually, which that was a double blow to the Confederacy, because if you think about it, if you're a plantation holder, you've got all these slaves working for you, and then they're gone, and then the next thing you know, they're coming back to fight you. So that's a double blow. But Lincoln was afraid that once the war ended, people would say, okay, that was a war measure? You said it was a war measure? The war's over, so it's not in effect anymore. And there was fear that the slaves would be re-enslaved, or at least some of them. So Lincoln wanted to make it the most permanent type of law we have in the United States, which is part of the Constitution.
So you could pretty much say, though, that in a way the 13th Amendment was more of a moral stance, because they could have always said that once all the southern states were defeated, if you want to come back to be a part of the Union again, you just have to get rid of slavery in your state constitution. That's one of the requirements. So basically, de facto slavery was ended except in those 4 or 5 states. So was it a way to say, you know what, we fought this Civil War, this was a big part of it, and now it's done?
I think so. I think there were a lot of things going on there. I mean, Lincoln was obviously, his entire life was opposed to slavery, but he was not a radical, as I mentioned, and he was willing to let it go, let it stand if the Union would be preserved. In fact, he famously was, people that don't like Lincoln often quote this, Lincoln said, if I could save the Union by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. If I could save the Union by freeing none of the slaves, I would do that. If I could save the Union by freeing some slaves and not freeing others, I would do that. So for Lincoln, the Union was actually more important than the freedom of the slaves at first. But again, over time, Lincoln, as the war progressed and more thousands and hundreds of thousands of people were dying, Lincoln decided, slavery is so wrong and so bad, and we fought this war, we've got to get rid of it permanently. We've got to have something in place that will make it forever impossible. So I think there was a moral component as well. But I think the primary motivation was so that nobody could ever reinstate slavery in any form or fashion. Ironically, though, sadly enough, as when Reconstruction ended, slavery was essentially reinstated, not in name, but de facto, by the fact that most Southern African Americans were forced to work on cotton farms and other types of plantations for very low wages, and they had limited freedom. So the 13th Amendment certainly made slavery, I don't know how to say it. It made actual slavery go away, but it didn't make necessarily de facto slavery go away. Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely. What's your final takeaway from this movie?
Oh, final takeaway. That's a big question. But, I think it's an important movie. I think it gives us a more realistic portrait of Lincoln than has tended to be presented in the past. I think it kind of, how do you say it? It demolishes the idea that Lincoln was a saint, that Lincoln never did anything wrong. I'm not saying that what he did was wrong. Some people would certainly say he did a lot of wrong things nowadays. There's a lot of revisionist history, but Lincoln was a human being, and Lincoln was a politician, and Lincoln was a leader who was faced with a crisis unlike any that any U.S. president has ever faced in our history. No U.S. president has had the Union fall apart right after they are elected and take office, Nobody's had to deal with that. Not Franklin Roosevelt, not Washington, not John F. Kennedy, nobody. Lincoln had, we talked about pressure earlier, Lincoln had more pressure on him than any other president in our history. And I think the movie does a good job of showing that pressure. It's interesting that there's several times in the movie where Lincoln loses his temper and he swears and he bangs the table. Those are probably not accurate. Lincoln was famous for almost never swearing. But still, I think they put that in there. Well, first of all, it's a modern movie, and you just can't have a movie without cuss words nowadays, right? But it's like a rule. You have to have them. But I think it shows to a modern audience the pressure he was under and how that, Lincoln, had he not been assassinated, I'm convinced that Lincoln probably would not have lived. He may have lived out his second term, but I don't know that he would have lived a long time after he had left office in 1869 had he survived, because just of the immense stress and strain that he went under.